that. Can anyone tell me what we talked about last time? What were some of the main themes and ideas that we looked at for this book, The Republic? What's Plato trying to get us to do here? What are some of the values he's trying to instill in us, or encourage us to at least reconsider?
Prioritize knowledge and reason over emotions and all the other things.
Right.
Those are,
Right. That is a big thing. It is it's a value that, since it has been popularized and written extensively on by Plato, has really been a huge part of the development of philosophy, right? Even so in our culture today, right? You'll hear people say, you're not listening to reason, right? You're letting your emotions cloud your judgments and all these things. So we see definitely in this work a prioritization of logic and reason over emotionality. What else? What else do we see in this work?
It was like something about not prioritizing power and more like your individual knowledge or what you know personally.
Right. There's this idea that even though in democratic Athens at the time, there are these people that have a certain amount of status and a certain amount of power, that status or that power doesn't clue us into whether or not what they say is epistemically adequate, right? You can listen to someone who has power, you can listen to someone who has authority and do what they say, but just because they have power or authority doesn't mean they know what they're talking about, right? I'm sure you feel this way about a lot of politicians that we have nowadays, right? Just because they're elected into office doesn't mean they know what they're talking about, right? So also closely aligned with this idea of reason and knowledge should be prioritized over emotionality, when we have discussions with people or we're trying to understand the way the world works, we should prioritize knowledge over whatever kind of status they have, whatever earthly authority that they have. That doesn't necessarily clue us into that they know what they're talking about, or that they understand how things work. What else? What are some of the other things we talked about? All these themes are kind of closely aligned. They kind of bleed into one another. What did you write down in your notes? Yeah.
dialect should be prioritized over rhetoric.
Right. There's this idea that if we want to get to the bottom of things, if we want to understand how the world works, that can only occur through a dialectical process. Having conversations with others, engaging reflectively, and kind of having like a dialogue with yourself, right? When you're thinking through things, actually questioning your beliefs. In this way, truth, we're supposed to be getting at truth, that should be one of our top priorities. In order to do that, we need to engage in a dialectical process, whether that's with other people, speaking with them, or with ourselves. Not just using rhetoric, not just appealing to people's emotions or just following our own emotions. Anything else? Anything else that you can remember? This is going to seem like a trivial one, a really basic one, but there's also this prioritization of reality over appearance, right? We're trying to understand the nature of reality. We're trying to understand how the world works. We're getting these images and appearances thrown at us all the time, right? You're getting all the sense data. You're hearing these things in the media. But that doesn't necessarily line up with how the world actually is, right? Sometimes appearance matches reality, but we're going to be much better off if we actually try to understand reality and operate according to its rules and what's going on in reality than just what's going on in the realm of appearances, the realm of the senses, right? We talked about the cave last class and how Plato sets up this picture in which the people who aren't thinking about their beliefs and questioning them and having conversations with others are living in this realm of appearance in which they're basically just looking at shadows on walls, right? They don't really know what's going on. They don't really understand the world. They're just accepting everything that's thrown at them, and they're not questioning it. But that's not good. That's not how we become better people, according to Plato, and that's not how we construct a functional society. Anybody remember anything else that we talked about? Anything that struck a chord with you last class? Yeah.
Just like the communal living, he believes like that's the ideal society.
Yeah.
Like village living, I guess. That stuck with me.
Right, yeah, we're going to be getting into more of that today. Exactly the characteristics of what this ideal society looks like. But first, we have to walk through this long kind of extended description that Plato gives of the different constitutions of a city and the different constitutions of one's character. So let's start with that today. Actually, before I get into that, I just want to ask one question. Did anybody go back and reread the assignment after last lecture and pull anything else from it? Did you see any of these themes present in it or these ideas that you didn't see before?
After you mentioned like all the figurative language, like I don't know, I guess the first time I just kind of like read through it, but since you said that, I kind of like picked it up. I was like, oh, look at that. Like I just like noticed it more.
Right. There are a lot of really cool things going on in this book. There are philosophical arguments being made. There is a mythology presented at the end of the book, a story or a narrative, and there are lots of literary devices that Plato is using in order to make his points. We're actually going to go through a little bit of that today after I do kind of a summary of this specific chapter. So let's kind of jump into that. What Plato is talking about in this chapter is it's couched within this discussion of the ideal society and the ideal human character. And he basically describes in this chapter not only how society can degenerate and the stages that it goes through this process of degeneration, but he describes kind of 5 basic constitutions of character. He makes kind of this argument that the character or the nature of a society is directly related to the character or the inner workings of the individuals in that society. And this is something that we talked about last class too, right? One of Plato's main points in this book is that the character of a society, whether or not it's functional, whether or not it's just, is going to mirror the characters of the individuals in that society, right? They're interdependent and they're intertwined in a certain way. If you have a bunch of people in society that are not virtuous, that are ruled by their desires and their emotions, you're going to have a society that's like that too. So if you want to have a virtuous society, you need to have virtuous people. Now he describes some of these basic constitutions of society that arise from these basic constitutions of character. The first and best that he talks about is the Aristocratic Constitution. Which is lined up or mirrors the aristocratic form of social organization in a larger city. How does he describe this constitution? Well, when we think about the aristocratic person and the aristocratic society, it's structured in a certain way. It's ruled by reason and knowledge. According to Plato's ideal society, in which he advocates for a kind of epistocracy, the rulers, the ones who are making the rules and the ones who are making the political decisions, are going to be using reason and knowledge in order to do that. That is the method by which they're going to make sure society keeps on functioning into the future. But there's also a very important moral element to the Aristocratic Constitution. The way Plato envisions all this is that not only do these rulers, these philosopher kings who he wants to rule society, not only are they intellectual, but they're also supposed to be extremely moral people. They're not supposed to have any lust or any desire for power. They're not really supposed to care really about these worldly things, about luxuries, about pursuing hedonistic pleasure or anything like that. These people that he envisions that are ruled by reason and knowledge are also going to be virtuous people. They're going to be moral people. And so they're going to value the good. They're going to value what's right. And they're going to embody the three primary virtues: wisdom, moderation, and courage. Pay close attention to the way I've described kind of this ideal society, the constitution of this ideal society that Plato is advocating for, and how that is connected to the constitution of individual people. Because as we'll see as we walk through this, as Plato describes how and why societal degeneration occurs, it's going to be in large part because of the individuals in the society undergo a certain degeneration of character. These virtues are going to kind of drop out of the equation. As we move from the higher and more noble constitutions to the kind of more base and tyrannical ones, you're going to see that the people that have these constitutions and the society that have these constitutions aren't going to be embodying these characters, these virtues, and they're going to have different values too. Now, it's important that you understand that this idea of the good is important in Greek philosophy. We talked a little bit about it in Aristotle, right? His whole ethical theory was based around this idea that what's good for a thing is for that thing to perform its function, yada, yada, yada. But this idea of the good, or of what's moral, or of what's right, is closely related to other values that philosophers have been talking about for a really long time. In ancient Greek philosophy, truth, beauty, and goodness are all interconnected and intertwined in a certain way. In our modern day and age, we think of goodness and beauty and truth as these separate things. And we categorize things, based on whether or not that thing is true, or that thing is beautiful, or that thing is good. But the ancient Greeks had this idea that wherever there was one of these, the others were there too. So if you have a moral person, a person who's virtuous, they're also going to be a person who tells the truth. And there is going to be something beautiful in the way that they live their lives. Similarly, when you see an amazing vista or a sunset, and that's really beautiful and that strikes you, there is also a goodness to that event, to that thing, and there is some truth within that thing too. So there's this idea that truth, goodness, and beauty are all kind of interconnected. So what Plato is talking about here when he's talking about the virtuous person and the virtuous or the just society is he's describing something that's not only good, but it's also true and it's also beautiful in a certain way. these descriptions kind of are packaged together. So just kind of keep that in the back of your minds as we go through this, because as he describes the constitutions that are not as noble as the aristocratic one, you'll see that he doesn't describe them in a very pleasing way, in a very beautiful way, and he's going to imply that the way that these people and these societies operate, they're more associated with a falsehood or a falseness than the truth of the way that things really are. They're operating more in the realm of appearances rather than in the realm of reality. So the first constitution he describes is the aristocratic one. We could also have a society or somebody ruled by a timocratic constitution. This is one step down from the aristocrat. Rather than being ruled by reason and knowledge, the timocratic person is ruled by ambition and honor. These are kind of a half enlightened, you can think of the timocratic person as like a half enlightened Homeric hero. They're after honor, they're trying to do heroic deeds, they're spirited people, but their passions, their spirit for things kind of sometimes get in the way of engaging in an enlightened way with reality. They kind of override reason, override dialectical processes sometimes. They can be swept up in their emotions and in their desires in a way that the aristocrat isn't supposed to be, because he's ruled or she's ruled by reason and knowledge. They also have a different value, or they value different things than the aristocratic person. The timocratic person, or the timocratic society, values power. When you think of the Homeric hero who is trying to leave a legacy for themselves, how do you do that? Well, you cultivate power for yourself so you can do these deeds that are going to be remembered. In this way, you do things that are kind of honorable sometimes, but your primary value isn't the good, or the beautiful, or the true. It's something like being remembered after you die. Being seen by others, having a certain power and status from that. Consequently, because they're not ruled by reason and knowledge, and they don't value the good above all else, they're going to not fully embody all of these virtues either. They're going to embody the virtues of moderation and courage, but they're not necessarily going to always embody wisdom. They're definitely going to be courageous people, right? You can kind of think of timocratic people as being similar to the poet guardians in Plato's ideal society. They're ruled by this, or they have a very fiery spirit, a very tenacious energy about them. But that tenacity, those feelings of deep emotion that they have and these deep passions that they're going to have for their community aren't going to allow them to operate according to wisdom like the philosopher kings are all the time. So they're going to embody courage, they're going to be courageous, they're going to be brave and face things, and they're going to embody moderation. They're not going to go overboard with, food or sex or luxuries or any of these things. But they're not going to be able to embody wisdom to the degree that the philosopher is, who has organized his or her inner character such that they don't give their emotions free rein. Their emotions are always kind of restricted by their logical reasoning part of themselves. An even more, perhaps, degenerate constitution that an individual can embody, or a society can embody, is one that's an oligarchy. Does anybody know what an oligarchic society is like? Does anybody remember their government or economics class from high school? You guys talk about oligarchies?
I feel like I could be wrong, but isn't it just like when the wealthy run everything, like they run the government?
Right, exactly. Yep. When you have an oligarchy, that is basically rule by the people who have money. And so the person who has an oligarchic constitution, a society which has an oligarchic constitution, is going to be ruled by pleasure. Think about this in your own experience. Are the rich people you know in society good people more often than not? Not usually, right? But what does seem to be the thing that they value? What do they use their money for? Living a fucking fun life, man, right? You got your yachts, you got your, supermodels that hang out with you. You get to have all the best food and drinks, right? The society or the person that has an oligarchic constitution is ruled by pleasure. They're trying to go after pleasure, to live a pleasurable life, and what they do and how they think is structured by this desire for pleasure. Therefore, what do you think they're going to value? What's the surest way of achieving pleasure in this life? If we're talking about yachts and all the best food and all the best drinks, how do you get that stuff? What do you need? Money, right? They're going to value money. They're going to value money because money is going to be able to allow them to fulfill their pleasures. Now, do you think they're going to embody any of these virtues? Maybe you're looking at the rich people in society now and you're like, no, they don't embody any of them. But Plato says they probably will embody at least one of these. Are rich people going to be ruled by knowledge and reason, and therefore are they going to be wise necessarily? Plato doesn't think so. Are they going to be courageous people? These people that live for pleasure and they're like, oh, I gotta satiate my desires. Or are they going to kind of run from trouble and be like, I want to live another day so I can keep, having that good sex and that good food? Plato's going to say they're not going to embody courage. If they embody a virtue, it's probably going to be moderation to a certain extent, because they recognize that if they really went all in on pleasure and desire, they would ruin their own lives. So they have some sort of moderation. They're not always engaged in, orgies and drug use. Only sometimes, when they're not doing their business transactions and whatever else. We're speaking rather generally here. And obviously this isn't going to be the case for everyone. And people can embody kind of these constitutions to different degrees, right? You don't have, you probably are not purely an aristocrat, or right now purely a timocrat, or purely an oligarch or something. Our constitutions are kind of a mixture of these. But what Plato is trying to describe here is just give us kind of a basic sketch of what some characters that we see in society are like, what they're ruled by, and therefore what societies that are made up of these people are going to be like. The second least noble constitution is the democratic one. The second least, perhaps, noble or virtuous society, then, is going to be the democratic one. Whereas these first three constitutions have one primary desire or one primary value that structures their life. What do you think the democratic person or the democratic society is going to be like? Are they going to have one thing that kind of motivates them and structures how they live? What does the word democracy mean when you think about it in political terms? It's kind of ruled by the people, right? The majority. Right? Everybody has a say. Likewise, the democratic person, the person who has a democratic constitution, a society which is democratic, is ruled by many desires. They are pulled this way and that by all sorts of desires that are vying for power within the person or within the society. Right? And the same can be said of society as well. In a democratic society, the people, to a large degree, are not aligned in their beliefs and their values and their cultures. Right? They all have different views of the way the world works. They all have different values. They all have different ways that they'd like to see society organized. And so, within the democratic constitution of a society and a person, that body is going to be pulled in multiple different directions. So the democratic person, who has a democratic constitution, is going to be pulled this way and that by many desires. Their desire for safety, their desire for control, their desire for pleasure, their desire for justice, their desire for equality. All of these things are kind of pulling the person in different directions. And the same is true of a democratic society. Insofar as the people in a democratic society are different, they're going to pull society in different directions. Right? Society isn't going to be headed down one path towards one goal in a democratic society, because you have all these individual components that are pulling it in different directions. Does that make sense? Kind of what Plato's trying to say here?
I don't understand why democracy is so much less desirable than, like, especially oligarchy.
Well, as we'll see, when we get to how Plato describes how and why societies degenerate, he's going to take as the ideal form of society this, the aristocracy, and basically the degeneration from an aristocracy to a tyranny, it doesn't pass through the democratic stage until much later. So, the oligarchy, according to Plato, is going to tend to be a more virtuous society, because these societies, if they started out great and then entropically kind of go to ruin, these people are going to kind of have more of the virtues and more of the traditions and more of the cohesion of that society than the democratic society, which is being pulled in many different directions, and they're not as unified. So you can disagree with him on that, because obviously there are, oligarchies that are way worse than democracies in our society, well, in our world. But the reason why he's kind of rank ordered them like this is because when a society falls to ruin, he has a certain picture of how that happens, and it's just that it goes to this stage kind of before it goes to this stage. So, but none of this necessarily implies that these societies will be any better than another one necessarily. This is just his view of things, how the different constitutions compare to one another if you start with an ideal aristocratic society and it degenerates from there. right? Because obviously we have a kind of a democratic society in the United States, and it seems a lot better than, maybe some of these other forms in other countries, right? But we didn't start, and perhaps maybe you would argue we did start with something like this, but we'll get to that in a little bit. What do democracies value? What do we value in the United States? What is the magic word?
Well, it's supposed to be like freedom.
Freedom! Yeah! Very good. Democracies are going to value freedom. Why? Why are they going to value freedom? So they have the freedom to fulfill all these desires. They're going to value freedom so they can do whatever the hell they want when they want it. They can satiate the desire when they want to satiate it. Their character isn't hierarchically organized with reason and knowledge at the top, right? It's kind of like it's more of a plane. It's more horizontally organized than it is vertically organized. So freedom is what's going to allow the democratic person and the democratic society to, take the cookie when it wants it, have the orgy when it wants it, go down to the lake and have on a nature walk when it wants it, do the philosophy when it wants it. But none of these necessarily are always prioritized over any of the other desires. So they're going to value freedom. And the democratic society, Plato thinks, isn't going to, as a whole, embody really any of these virtues. It's not going to be structured and organized and have its priorities straight, kind of like some of these other societies or constitutions. Rather, it's going to tend to embody chaos. Think about this picture within the context of your own life and how it is that you act. If you were ruled by reason and knowledge, and that was your top priority, there would be a bunch of things that you wouldn't be able to do, right? A bunch of different ways that you would have to act in order to uphold this priority. Your way of life would be more structured. Whether or not it would be good is a different question, but it would be more structured than a democratic constitution. To a certain degree, we all have a democratic constitution, right? Does anybody prioritize one thing in their life so highly that they have never transgressed doing the thing to serve that purpose? No. You might say you're a Christian and you serve God above all else, but you still sin, right? You might say that you value social justice above all else, but you still buy stuff off Uber Eats and you contribute to the, patriarchal capitalist system that we're all living in, right? If any of those values or desires were your top priority such that you never reneged on them, you never transgressed them, you would have a much different constitution than you do now. But how is it that you and I act? When we're hungry, we go eat. When we want to watch Netflix, we do that, right? When we are feeling cooped up in our dorm rooms, we go for a nature walk. But going for a nature walk doesn't take priority all the time over watching Netflix. Watching Netflix doesn't take priority over calling your parents all the time, right? We're not ruled by some sort of value or purpose that we place above all else and never not do that thing, right? Insofar as that's true for each one of us, we are ruled by many desires, we are pulled in all these different directions, and we do embody kind of chaotic existences to a certain extent. Our lives are not as structured and as ordered as they could be. right? Sometimes we don't go to the gym when we know we should. Sometimes we have that extra piece of pizza when we know we shouldn't, right? Sometimes we have that extra drink when we know we shouldn't, right? So when you're thinking about these constitutions, try to tie it back to how you think and act, and how the people that you know in your life that operate by certain principles, how they think and act, right? And how their lives are ordered differently than yours, and how your life is ordered differently than theirs. Finally, the last constitution that Plato talks about, which is the worst one for a society and a person to have, is a tyrannical constitution. Let me make sure I'm spelling this right. What do you think the tyrant is ruled by? This is kind of hard. This one is you kind of have to read in between the lines to kind of pull out what Plato's kind of saying here. How do tyrants act? Think of somebody in your life that you consider a tyrant. What drives them? What are they afraid of? What do they want? What are they trying to get?
I would have said like chaos, but we said that for democracies, so I don't know.
You're right. The tyrant is to a certain degree going to embody chaos. Right. Yeah, that's true. The person who's a tyrant, who needs to impose their will on the world, and everything needs to go according to their plan when they want it all the time, what's normally motivating that kind of behavior? What do they value? They value control, right? They want control kind of over their own lives, and to a certain extent, in order to make sure that they control what happens to them and how they feel, they externalize that control out on others. They impose their will on others. They judge others when they don't do, what they should do. They are violent against other people sometimes in order to make sure their will is being instantiated in the world so things go according to plan, so they have control, so they never lose control, right? We're getting kind of psychoanalytic here. We can say they're ruled by the desire for freedom in a certain way. Their desire to control everything is so that they can be free not only of all the things that plague them, but of all the bad things that could happen to them now and into the future. Right? Some people in the democratic society may embody the virtues sometimes, but the tyrant embodies vice, the opposite of virtue. When you think about the people who are tyrants in your own lives, whatever that means to you, they're not happy, nice people, right? They desire, they long, they seek after control, so much so that they're going to try to control your life, right? When you do something that bugs them. And it's because they're trying to escape from or want freedom from all of these issues that are plaguing them, all of these negative emotions, all of these bad things that are happening in their life, that they externalize their need for control outwards on the world. They're tyrannical. And so they're going to be plagued with vices. They're not going to be good people. They're not going to be kind. They're not going to be polite. They will use violence to achieve their ends if they're a tyrant to a certain degree. right? So we can think of the constitutions that Plato here is describing as some basic ways that society is organized, which is downstream from the way individuals themselves have organized their own character. Right? If you're valuing control in your life above everything else, you're going to step on people's toes. You're going to lash out at people. You're not going to be a well-regulated person. If you value freedom, above everything else, again, you're not going to have a very structured, well-ordered life, because there isn't some sort of transcendent value or priority that is giving you an order or a structure. You're going to be pulled in all these different directions by all these desires that you have. And insofar as people are embodying these certain constitutions, a society will also embody largely this kind of nature, this kind of character. All of this is couched within Plato's discussion of how societies degenerate and why. So let's turn to that now, because I think it'll give you a better understanding of why I've described things in this way and why this even matters in the first place. The first thing that we need to note, if we're going to understand how and why societies change, and therefore how and why societies degenerate, is what is the nature or what is the priority of the ruling element or elements within the person or within society. Although he doesn't say it explicitly in this chapter, Plato implies that societies change, people's characters change, when there is a change in the ruling element of that system. Whether you realize it or not, societies and individuals are constituted in such a way that there are certain things that you prioritize over other things. There are certain ways of thinking you prioritize over other ways of thinking. There are certain values that you have that are more important to you than other values. So whatever are these values or these perspectives or these purposes that you have in your life, the ruling elements, whatever those are, is going to affect how you act, how you think. And whenever those ruling elements are changed in a person or in a society, that's when change occurs in the rest of the system. For example, you're living your life right now. Let's say you're not extremely happy with it. You want to change some things. You decide, all right, I want to be healthier. So I'm going to go to the gym every day, for the next month. Your primary value has shifted, right? You're no longer valuing, say, just satiating your desires, but now you're valuing health. So an element of what is structuring your life, this ruling element, one of your top priorities, from satiating desire to being healthy, has changed. Since that ruling element in your life has changed, the rest of the system is going to change too. You're going to change how you act. You are going to go to the gym if this now is your top priority, being healthy, right? Or let's say your top priority is, finishing a project before the deadline. You have this deadline coming up. You've been procrastinating for weeks, you haven't been doing anything. All of a sudden now you're like, shit, I really got to get this thing done. That value or that priority has now taken precedence over the other things in your life, right? And you orient your life in order to follow what that ruling element has to say or what it prescribes. So you'll stay up all night to finish it, right? If it really is your top priority. Or you'll organize your life around getting that thing done before you do the stuff that you would do in your free time, right? So it's a general point, and it seems kind of trivial, but it's important for understanding why people change individually and why societies change. When there is a change in the ruling element of the system, then the rest of the system follows suit. So for example, if you're really healthy and you're really fit and you're really active and all of a sudden you don't really value health anymore, you don't really value that stuff, instead you value, binging the next series on Netflix more, you're going to start living in a lazier way, in a not as active way. Your priority has changed, so your behavior changes. Another thing that can change your priorities or your values, another thing that can change the way society functions, is a change in education, right? If you have a society that is being given a good education, but then the educational system changes drastically and starts valuing different things and starts teaching different contents, then the society is going to be changed as well, right? Because now you're inculcating people in society with this whole other outlook that has different priorities and values in it. Whether you realize it or not, something about your own individual character and something about the character of society is hierarchically organized. You have values that mean more to you than other values. You have desires that mean more to you than other desires. You have purposes that are more meaningful to you than other purposes, other goals. And so what those top priorities or values or desires or purposes are, the ruling elements, are going to affect how you think and act. This leads us into Plato's discussion of how societies change and why they change. Plato spends a lot of time in this section sketching out this long hypothetical picture of how it is a society or a person could degenerate from virtue and a noble aristocratic constitution all the way down to a vicious tyrannical constitution. In order for a society or a person to devolve from the aristocratic constitution to the timocratic one, he says that primarily what happens is there's a bad education that starts to become instantiated in that society. Bad education causes honor to be valued more than knowledge. Once this has happened, and it's become instantiated in society enough such that the people in the society value honor more than knowledge, the system slips from an aristocratic, noble one ruled by reason and knowledge to a timocratic system. And the moral character of the society or of the person also degenerates slightly, as we saw earlier with the different virtues that these constitutions embody. If the degeneration continues, if people start to value honor more and more over knowledge, this kind of sets them down a certain path in which people lose the ability to engage in self-control, and they begin to covet things. This ends up producing an oligarchy. Because remember, the aristocrat, or the philosopher, or the person who's ruled by knowledge, also has self-control, right? They have control over their desires. They don't do what their desires and their passions always tell them to do. But if the degeneration in a person or a society continues, they lose this ability to have control over their own desires and over their own impulses. They begin to covet what other people have. They begin to engage perhaps in impulsive or risky behavior. And it produces people that value money, because that money is going to be able to allow them to gratify their impulses, right, and their desires. Continuing on. If a society or a person engages in a very materialistic, hedonistic lifestyle long enough, it causes them to devolve further into chaos. Being able to gratify their desires, not